Hi, I'm Liz, and I'm a student at the University of Southern Maine, and I'm looking forward to going on the Denmark Energy Study Tour in May of 2013. We've been asked to consider our carbon emissions for the trip and to come up with a strategy to offset them, and this is my plan. We'll be going from Portland, Maine to Copenhagen and spending 8 nights. And we had to consider what gets counted in terms of emissions, the emissions that we need to offset. And that really comes down to the emissions that are above and beyond our normal carbon footprint. That's our bus trips from Portland to Boston and back, our flights from Boston to Copenhagen and back, and a chartered bus tour within Denmark. I figure the trip will increase my annual carbon footprint by between 2,500 and 7,400 pounds of CO2. And those numbers vary so significantly because it all depends on how you measure carbon emissions. The internet makes assessing carbon impact comprehensible. There's a lot of information and a lot of ways to understand how we're impacting our climate. But finding the right CO2 calculator is not as simple as it appears because the numbers and the calculations vary significantly. They vary by what they measure and how they calculate emissions. And here are some examples. TerraPass.com is from the University of Pennsylvania. They don't look at bus emissions, but they looked at our flight emissions based on the mileage and calculated our impact at 6,290 pounds of CO2 per person for the flight. They also enabled a $17.85 carbon offset. And I liked TerraPass.com because they're supporting projects, mostly it seemed in the United States, carbon capturing projects that might not normally be part of our economic market system. So they're essentially they're supporting this new market for carbon capture and carbon offset. But $17 is not a lot of money. Carbonfootprint.com did have bus and coach calculations, which they came up with 43.6 pounds of CO2 for the coach trips. For our air travel, they also included radiative forcing, a multiplier of 1.9 for high altitude emissions, and I understand that as the emissions at high altitude in the thinner air that have a greater impact on our climate and on climate change. CarbonNeutralCalculator.com came up with a pretty low number of 2,400 pounds of CO2 emitted per passenger. They also had an offset, the ability to have an offset contribution. SwissMyClimate.org measured our flight emissions at 3,000 pounds of CO2 and also supports projects in Africa. CarbonFund.org is US based and they're had the highest calculation for our flight emissions with radiative forcing at 7,360 pounds of CO2. They gave some different options for offsetting the CO2 emissions, and they also cite third-party verification of all the sustainability projects they support. So this isn't an exact science, but the bus and coach came to about 43.6 pounds of CO2 emissions. I found those numbers across 2 different calculators, so I went with that. And then I went with the TerraPass figure of 6,290 pounds. The grand total was 6,333.6 pounds. In thinking about how I wanted to approach the offsets, I wished that I would do something other than pay. That seemed like the easy way out. So I had to ask if there was any room for improvement at home and also look at what my usual carbon footprint is. I live with my family in an old house in South Portland, Maine. And we have 2 cars, but we ride our bikes a lot. The cars are not terribly efficient, but I think we're fairly significantly below the average American family. And we do have a Dutch bike that we use around the neighborhood. We recently switched to natural gas, and while I'm concerned about the fracking issues, we have reduced our electricity and heating emissions to still a fairly high amount of 30,000 pounds of CO2 a year. That's still below the national average. We reuse and recycle everything we can. We compost. We don't have an air conditioner. We dry our clothes outside, and we've been replacing light bulbs and appliances, and this summer we're replacing all of our windows. So according to the EPA's household carbon footprint calculator, which I found to be pretty comprehensive, our footprint is 28,334 pounds a year compared to the national average of 83,000 pounds. Alternatives for offsets. An incremental approach is using more cold water, riding the bike more. More substantive would be installing a solar hot water heater, which would be a reduction of 4,400 pounds of CO2 a year. And then in terms of my time and an investment, the most efficient thing would probably be paying for a carbon offset through a responsible entity. So what I've decided to do is go ahead and purchase a carbon offset for 7,000 pounds of CO2, which is more than the total that I came up with, but feels like the right amount to me. I'm going to try to do a little bit more at home by washing more laundry in cold water, putting a timer in the shower, and eating less meat. And I really do want to install a solar water heater within 2 years. I also believe that it's important to get outside and really enjoy the world that we're trying to protect for the next generation. I'm really looking forward to our trip and learning more about energy efficiency and sustainability. Thank you.